I'm gonna build this, you know. And she was just going with it. Well, she's a painter too, and so she really got it, and so that was like, yeah, you know, eventually this is going to be an out, and then it was like, oh yeah, the eventual outcome of an instant, and so that's when we built this piece based on her painting called Hyphen, which is another great title, and you know, all of her titles, In the Third Sleep. Wow, you know. So yeah.
Well, the story of building Hyphen, I think, relates to the eventual outcome of an instant. What that means is language and catastrophe, and I wonder if you could talk about the fires that played a role.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay, so the whole idea of Seligman and the mirror of magic and the occult, because the you know, the surrealists were super into the occult, and so we were thinking about, we would build this sculpture out of doors and windows, and that's actually how I built the maquette, to look like maybe these were doors and windows, and we were going to find materials that were tossed away or whatever. And in the meantime, this fire had ripped through a lumber yard 2 miles from the center, and basically the center was like, we think we can get this wood donated, come out and look at it. So I drove like 5 miles. I was really obsessed. I had to see this like burned lumber pile, and I was photographing it, and they were like, yeah, we got this lumber, we can use it. And so that was great. And in the meantime, the students had been doing research on Kay Sage, and my student, Kelly Hendrickson, she was like, Sue, I just read this thing about Kay Sage before she painted Tomorrow Is Never, actually dreamed of burning scaffolds. And I was like, awesome. So it really, like, it had that kind of element of the occult magic and serendipity and all these things that...
And that catastrophe can lead to something positive. And before she started painting, she had taken a number of years off from painting, I think, and was having a hard time getting back to work, and then I think this dream is what sparked her going back into the studio. So I think of your sculpture Hyphen as maybe leading you into this sculptural practice and allowing us to do the work out here in the park. I think we're getting a little bit close to time, and I want to open up the conversation to all of you here. I want to ask, though, what are you doing next?
Well, interestingly enough, so when we did the response pieces, you had introduced me to a philosopher. I think Sarah reached out because you asked, like, who would you like to come, and I was like, well, it'd be great to have a philosopher do something, you know. And you found Rachel Jones, and so it turned out we actually both work at Mason. And we started talking about this idea of contingency, which is, you know, part of the whole language of the Anthropocene. And anyway, so there's a philosophy conference that's happening in Richmond, Virginia. It's Feminist Philosophy, Philosophia, and we're going to prepare something to submit to that, and, you know, imagery and a paper. But as we were talking about it, we both got on the topic of coal, and I have a project that I sort of let go of throughout all this about coal, being from Western Pennsylvania, and I actually worked in a steel mill, and my grandfather was, you know, he was an immigrant, and he worked on the coal mines, and my other grandfather, who was also an immigrant, worked in the railroads. And so, you know, that whole narrative is like so much a part of something that I feel like we need to do. So I'm planning to go to Slovakia this summer for a couple weeks and kind of research some things, but it's interesting to me to see like how coal has created societies and also has
Destroyed.
yes, so I don't know, I'm just interested in that material right now, and I have a lot of research behind that, so I want to start working on that.
Great. Well, I'm going to take the opportunity too. I forgot to plug our creative responses series. So thank you for reminding me. We're done with the ones for Sue's show, but this is a new public program that we've started where we're inviting people to come and respond to the artwork on view. So we've had choreographers and poets and philosophers and other visual artists, and we ask that they just come and talk about how their practice relates to what they see, or it's meant to be creative. So we're going to continue that with our next show, Paulina Peavy. They're Thursday evenings. Previously they were at 6 o'clock. I think we're going to make them a little later so that more people can get here during rush hour, but stay tuned for that. And thank you.
Thank you.
Let's, the other people have questions. I can keep asking them. There must be a question
I
or
have
two.
a question.
Great.
You said you were going to be doing an outdoor sculpture.
Yes.
Is that a
Yes.
secret? I didn't. I was like,
No.
can we hear
No.
about that?
Yeah, the maquette courts are right over there.
Okay.
In the entryway, and I'm working, I talked to Justin today about doing the design, you know, and so that's also, that was like the original maquette for the K-Sage piece, and then when I figured we would make it out of doors and windows, it changed. But I think when Lily came into my studio, she really liked that piece, and so through a bunch of conversations, we decided that we would do that, and actually, I'm hoping, like, Lord Regul is here, and I think there will be a piece around that as well. So that we're talking about the spring, and yeah, like we're talking about this 30-foot sculpture, and building it out a little more on the bottom so the kids have something to roam around in, and so yeah, that's and we're talking about telephone poles, maybe. Use telephone poles.
Yeah, we're still exploring how we're going to get this thing up, but I think one of the reasons I was really interested in that particular sculpture was this idea of the parallax that you talked about, and Sage painted all of her scaffoldings in desolate landscapes. Well, this is not a desolate landscape, so what happens when we take one of her images and put it here in a very vertical urban environment? I think it will be exciting. Yeah?
How would you like approach people with like portraiture and stuff? Like, you just walk up to them like, hey, can I take a picture? Because like I've tried that a couple times. It's just like, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think what you need to do is try it with a large format camera, and you'll have no problem. People asking you, what's that camera about? Because, you know, they're very, I don't know what you're photographing with actually, but I think it's, you know, it's kind of like, you kind of, I don't know, for me it was more, I was just kind of walking around and looking at stuff and talking, you know, talking to people about anything. And I think as time went on, it became more specific. Like, may I take your photograph? You know, would you sign a model release? You know, that sort of thing. But I think it's like, you know, putting them at ease. There's a lot of, I think our culture today is a lot different than, let's say, it was 20 years ago in terms of photography, for sure, of people. And I think that one of the things about it is, you know, first of all, we have digital media and we have the internet, and the next thing you know, like, somebody could be all over the internet and they're like, I didn't permit that. So, so there's more of a wariness. And so let's take somebody like Robert Frank. You know his work in the 50s? Okay, the book called The Americans. Should you have a look at that? So basically Robert Frank, shooting with this 35mm camera all around the United States, you know, really wasn't, people, you know, they really didn't care, I think, in some ways. There's one photograph where there was a real issue with it in San Francisco when he took a photograph of a couple. But I just think it's difficult. I think there's more of a difficulty to it these days. But I would just say, you know, be yourself and be curious and give people a photograph back if you can. So, yeah.
So, going from that, what I'm finding really interesting about your work, and I think you've said it already, so you started with portraiture, and you've moved into this kind of thing where there definitely is a presence of being of others, whether it's through your collaboration or sense of history in these things. And now moving to your next project with the coal. So it's in some ways portraiture without the people present.
I don't really know what's going to happen with that project. I have a lot of preliminary work that I've done with it. I have a lot of portraiture already, but you know, who knows when I did that? Probably back in Homestead in like 1993 or something. And I also have my father's photographs, who, you know, he has some imagery in there of, you know, that era, the steel era. Not much, but I pretty much grew up across the, like, maybe 2 streets away from the railroad tracks. So my father and I he taught me how to read the dates on the railroad cars. So it would, because when we had to cross over to the other road, we had to wait for the train to pass. So you would like look at the dates on the train cars, and that was kind of a game we played. So, you know, so trains were always in my life growing up. And actually, then they were carrying coal a lot of the time, because southwestern Pennsylvania is one of the richest coal resources on the earth, and which is why the steel industry grew up there. And so anyway, I was in Baltimore. When I lived in Baltimore, there's an area where they have a big coal terminal, right? And so sometimes you have to wait for these trains to pass before you can cross over the road. And I was sitting there one day, I'm looking at these train cars, and I'm like, you know, these really look like the ones that go past my mom's house. And sure enough, after some research, so that should give you a little bit of a clue.
Okay. Sounds exciting. I love it when there's we're enjoying something that you're showing us and hinting at something that's to come. It's a wonderful sense of anticipation.
Well, so much about our culture is totally reliant on transportation, right?
Could you talk a little more about the putting together this installation, how much you had planned and how much kind of surprised you along the way working within this space?
Sure. So the summer before we installed this, I worked with Harry Mayer, who was working with me at George Mason. He's one of our students, and we just kind of took over the drawing classroom one day, which has super high ceilings, and we sort of made this installation that we thought would be really cool. And I wanted him to understand, like, working with the sails and what that would mean. And then, of course, this space is much smaller and we couldn't do the same thing, so we had to really respond to the site. And I worked with Sarah and Sophia, actually, and a little bit with Harry. I think he was here, right? And one of the things that really kind of I wanted to do with it was hide the columns, because the columns were so hard and corner, really blocky, and the sails were so like flowing around. So I thought it'd be cool to make these rooms and like little like surprises and shelters and stuff. And so it was really organic. I think we would, look at things and say, well, maybe that can go up there and that can go there. And, so once you get something hung up, then you kind of turn it like, that was aesthetics right there, those decisions, so, yeah.
So I know like everything in this exhibit has similarities and stuff, they're sort of together. But there's this one near a panel, it's like branches covered in, painted in different colors.
Mhm.
What is that thing?
So that was supposed to be at the Seligman Center. They had a whole stand of trees that were killed by the ash borer. Okay, so I was thinking what we would do with that is put the sails and weave them around in the dead trees. But what happened was when we started to build Hyphen, it turned out the site was solid shale, okay? And we were building it on a hill, and that really stopped everything. And so we never got around to doing that maquette.
And what about the giant clothespin?
Oh, that's amazing.
Thank you for asking.
So the clothespin, okay, so when I was making the little paper maquettes, I went out to the clothesline at the residency actually, and I was like, oh, these will work. I thought, these are cool, and so anyway, and then when I started making maquettes, I was using them to attach things, and that, like when we think of laundry, we think of very, very female work, right? So I thought that was interesting, and but it was also really functional, and I don't know, like that little coil, if you twist it the wrong way, it totally blows apart, and anyway.
Yeah, I think they're pretty underrated.
Yeah, they are. They're really underrated. So anyway, I decided, what I really need for these sails is to have a giant clothespin. So I was talking to my friend Mia, who's a sculptor, and I said, hey, can you help me make this giant clothespin? And she was like, you can find that on the internet. I was like, really? So I go on the internet. Lo and behold, the only place that I find a giant clothespin is actually in Lexington, Virginia. I was looking all around the world because I was like, well, I'll pay postage for that. But that was the only place, so I ended up going down to Mary Jane Pickett Drake's house in her farm in Lexington, Virginia. We ended up spending the entire afternoon together having a blast. And I buy one of her clothespins. Her husband makes these beautiful structures, houses, out of the wood that's on their property. It was like La La Land. It turned out that she was also a professor of English, and she had, all these great stories, and yeah. And to me, it was like, wow, this clothes, and she sells them. If you want to buy them, they're, yeah, you can buy them.
Why does she make them?
Yeah, that's
Good question. We never got around to that.
You have to go back.
I think they were like lawn ornaments that you could buy, but if you look at it, it's like solid wood.
I know, I saw it.
It's not
Yeah,
laminated.
yeah.
It's serious business. So,
Well, does she sell a lot then?
I'll tell you what, she probably has plenty.
So I heard she
Go.
one.
Yeah, she's amazing. So,
Is it functional?
Yeah, that was the one thing. They just had like a wire that it looked like a real, coil, and so it wasn't going to function. So I found this place that makes truck springs for trucks, like big trucks, and they have these coils that suspend the truck. And I brought the clothespin over to them. They were like, "What is this for?" And my friend and I were like, "Oh, we just want to get a coil made for it." And he was like, "You know what, I'll weld that up for you." And I was like, "Well, how much?" He's like, "Look," he's like, "this is crazy enough, I'm just going to do it."
So it functions now.
Yes, it does, but it'll twist, and you have to be really careful. It's like a deadly twist. Yes.
Sue, I wonder if, for those who weren't at the last creative response, shelter is a big part of this project and a lot of what you do. And Kay Sage's legacy is a big part of what you do. And I had never heard the phrase until the last creative response that, especially when referring to that room to Lily's right, I think it was Rachel Jones, the philosopher, said, I love that you're sheltering Kay Sage there, with the maquettes that are in that space. And I know that it was very important for Lily in putting together this inspired show, this idea of bringing forward this notion that women surrealists have been shunted aside on some level and not gotten the attention that oftentimes their husbands have. There were multiple collaborative partnerships between husband and wife in the surrealist world. I wonder if either one of you would like to elaborate on that a little bit more. You did, of course, in your presentation, talking about couldn't stand that this is happening over and over again. And I wonder if either one of you, both really from your inspiration standpoint and Sue from your work standpoint, whether you'd like to elaborate on that.
I would just say that from the work, I definitely wanted to keep those maquettes together because they were all based on her painting in the Third Sleep. And I was also going to build that at the Seligman Center, but the Shale had different ideas. And but they're also really super fragile, and they're just kind of glue gun together, and so keeping them like kind of protected was important, and that's pretty much all I can say about that. But you could probably say more about Kay Sage than I can.
Well, I think historically, the story actually of Sage and Tanguy meeting is that he saw her work and assumed it was painted by a man and had inquired after it and ended up buying the painting that he first saw and was therefore introduced to Sage, who was a woman. And I think that, I don't know, I can't remember where it traveled to, but there was a terrific exhibition maybe 5 or 6 years ago of women surrealists at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and does anyone know it and maybe saw it somewhere else? But it was really, it was the first time that a lot of these painters had been taken out of museum basements to be on view. And I was actually just in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and in their surrealist room there was one female on view. So it's still an ongoing uncovering, but the National Gallery has their sages up on view, and I think there's actually a connection to this area as well, which is another serendipitous part of this project, in that Sage went to high school for a time in Middleburg, Virginia, and studied art at the Corcoran. So, there are these histories that are still just waiting to be discovered, and the fact that they can be discovered and brought forth by other artists, I think, makes it all the more powerful, because it brings that new perspective. And when I'm looking for new artists to talk to, and, the first place I go, the first people I ask are other artists. So to be able to discover historic artists through contemporary artists, I think, is also a really powerful narrative. So thank you for introducing me to K-Sage.
Yeah, I'd never heard of them until today, so I'm gonna look them up.
Yes.
I wonder, what do you think, I mean, you didn't talk about this, but I think it's a lot in the photographs about this notion of resistance and cover. And, you know, the sails are very much a force because they create resistance. So when we think about, you know, how we have evolved as a society, I mean, resistance is very much something that is part of our vocabulary, a force of good or a force of, you know, horrible things. So because of the words you use, I mean, I see poetry everywhere, but I think there's also this notion of you not allowing a lot of resistance in the process of creating and being very open, but also at the same time using a material that comes alive through resistance. So I don't know if I'm making that up in my head, but I wonder if you had anything to say about that, and if you have thought about it, I guess.
Yeah. Sometimes I think, you know, things present themselves to us as artists and we just figure out how to make it work. You know? I think that's a lot about it. But the, you know, the idea of the force and the resistance and everything is basically our ability to survive. And, you know, because the earth is a treacherous place when you think about it, and we're always protected, you know, at least here in this state, room, country in some ways. But I think what's interesting that came out of the talk with Rachel Jones was that, you know, as we move into a climate that's really changing, learning how to survive with that is also going to present, I think, with new solutions, hopefully. And, you know, that too, I think, is something to think about in terms of resistance, because the forces are obviously getting stronger. And so what are we gonna, how are we gonna build? How are we gonna shelter ourselves? How are we gonna, what's the answer to that? And that's something I think about all the time as a teacher. And because I know that the generation I'm teaching, they're gonna be faced with that. And so, you know, these questions, I think, like resistance, yes, it's in there in that way. Like there's resistance in politics for sure, but there's, you know, there's this other whole idea of resistance like based in survival, I think.
I think we should all look at the books. Can you say a word about the books? They're all hand sewn with the sale. They're for sale. They're
$250 plus Virginia tax. 10% of anything that I sell is going to an artist in St. Croix who's been affected by the hurricane through somebody I met at the Rauschenberg Foundation several years ago, and she lives, that's where she's from, and she knows, she told me she knows the perfect person that it could help. So, and so the books, the books. I never thought that making books would be so intense. But I have to say there's a ton of labor in them, and like hand stitching a book, but also like using the fabric from the sale and trying to figure out how to embroider that was a challenge. And learning how to use a CNC embroidery machine was a lot of fun when it works. So there's a great place in Baltimore called Open Works, and that's where I finished the books. And there's a fantastic woman there named Kaylee. I can't remember her last name, but she really helped me out a lot with getting it done. So anyway.
So get yourself Sue Wrbican artwork here today and support hurricane devastated artists in the process.
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.